Welcome to Cars with Kasey, episode 14. Today I'll be going over the history of the Pontiac brand. The history of Pontiac begins in the early 1920s. At the time, General Motors was beginning to see big gaps in their price ranges for the cars. At the time, GM had 5 brands, and in order of lowest range to highest range on that price scale was Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, Oakland, Buick, and Cadillac. GM ordered 4 of its brands to make variant models to fill the gaps between those brands, and those 4 were founded between 1926 and 1929. LaSalle was started by Cadillac and meant to fill the gap between Buick and Cadillac. Viking was begun by Oldsmobile to fill in between Oakland and Buick. Marquette was started by Buick to fill a gap between Oldsmobile and Oakland, and Pontiac was founded in 1926 to stretch between Chevrolet and Oldsmobile. Pontiac was the first of these companion makes and the only one to be successful. In fact, Pontiac was so successful that in just 5 years, their parent company had to be shut down due to dropping sales. The original Pontiac was a modified Chevrolet that had been given a little more ferocity. Rather than having the 2.8-liter inline-4 of the Chevrolet, it had a 3.1-liter inline-6. This upped the power output of the little car from 26 horsepower to 40 horsepower, with the red line at 2400 RPM rather than that 2000. The Pontiac 6 was offered as either a coupe or a 5-door coach. The coupe came in green, while a boxy coach came in gray. And the new brand sold over 70,000 vehicles in just its first year. And by 1928, Pontiac had become the best-selling car in the United States. During the Great Depression, Pontiac scored by using a tactic that other brands seem afraid of. Rather than reducing production, Pontiac simply dropped their prices. This greatly reduced short-term profit, but it maintained the popularity of the brand through the Depression. By then, Pontiac had upped power yet again with the now called Fine 6, putting out 60 horses from a 3.3-liter inline-6. In 1932, Pontiac absorbed its parent company Oakland due to Oakland sales failing during the Depression. This meant that Pontiac, for the first time, now offered 2 models, the second being what used to be the Oakland. It had an over-square V8 for 1932 only, producing 85 horses and redlining at 3,200 RPM. In 1933, Pontiac dropped both the 6 and the V8 model, instead opting for one straight 8 model that became the most affordable 8-cylinder model in the United States. It was a modified Chevrolet Master, but amped up to produce 77 horsepower from the inline 8. This lasted 2 years until the Pontiac 6 returned in 1935, as Pontiac began expanding its lineup. In 1937, Pontiac upped power yet again to 85 horses for the 6 and 100 horses for the 8. However, Pontiac's success had to be stopped, and the United States entered World War II. This indirectly meant that Pontiac had to stop all other ventures just to focus on military manufacturing. And by the time the war ended, Pontiac did not have the money to just design new cars off the bat. So 1942 models continued to be sold until Pontiac was able to recover in 1949. Pontiac completely revised their lineup, introducing the new Chieftain model with a new, low, and sloping body line. The Chieftain was based on the Chevrolet Deluxe and upped horsepower from a maximum of 90 to a minimum of 90, and going up to 106 horsepower. When the young men came home from World War II in Europe, they had been exposed to sports cars, and as such, they wanted exciting cars in the United States. Not only that, they had growing families and therefore needed a car to carry their family. Finally, these young men had no jobs yet, so they needed a car that would be affordable. And Pontiac hit this exact niche, and so Pontiac popularity exploded. In 1950, the new Catalina was introduced, and that was a model that would last for decades. But in 1953, trouble in Pontiac began. GM had begun sandbagging models to prevent detracting sales from models they deemed preferable. Pontiac, being a sports brand, tried to make their own version of the Corvette named the Bonneville. The Bonneville concepts were finished in a metallic bronze or an emerald green, and they produced 230 horsepower from their 4.4-liter inline 8, as opposed to the Corvette's 3.9-liter inline 6 with 150 horses. Pontiac's version of the Corvette had an 8-cylinder before the Corvette did. Not only that, it had double the gears, making it quite a bit faster than the Corvette. Also, Buick forced Pontiac to delay their V8s in 1953 to not detract from the new Buick V8, which didn't work, and now Pontiacs are far more sought after than Buick V8s. In 1955, Pontiac was finally allowed to introduce their new V8, and they nearly doubled the power output of previous models. In 1957, Pontiac was allowed to introduce their first over-the-top sports car, the Star Chief Bonneville. It was the first Pontiac car to use fuel injection, which it used to produce 300 horsepower and achieve much better fuel efficiency than other Star Chief models. In 1959, Pontiac got its iconic arrowhead emblem that has stayed with Pontiac to this day. In 1961, Pontiac introduced the Tempest. It was a little economy and sports car with either Pontiac's first four-cylinder or a V8. The transmission was a rear transaxle, giving the compact muscle car near perfect balance. In 1963, GM ordered its subsidiaries that no small car can have a large V8. This cracked down on Pontiac hard because Pontiac's whole idea was affordable sports cars. But Pontiac did not care, so they slightly upped the size of the Tempest, made it a conventional car, and rebadged the V8 trim into the GTO and kick-started the golden age of American muscle, the time period where the United States, and specifically Detroit, were the capital of the car world. The GTO was only expected to sell about 5,000 units, but instead they sold over 30,000 of them. Since the GTO sold well, GM didn't want to do anything about it, but that ban on larger engines did force Pontiac to shut down a project that was rather interesting. Pontiac had been making a big block V8 that had an overhead camshaft with wild numbers. The engine was a 6.9-liter V8 that redlined at about 7,000 RPM, and it can produce 625 horsepower. That's old power, not new power that's bogged through complex transmissions, tight tolerances, and all the electronic assistance to control it. That's 625 raw, angry, screaming American horses. 3 of these engines were built, and at least one of them was actually put into a car when the engineer retired. The next production GM car to break 600 horsepower was a Corvette ZR1 over 40 years later. The next important Pontiac was the F-body Firebird in 1967. It originally started as the open-eyed clone of the Camaro, still with Native American-inspired badging and styling, and with a new Pontiac V8 under the hood instead of a Chevrolet. The Firebird would, alongside the Corvette, become one of the most patriotic cars in America. The next strike against Pontiac came in 1970 with the emissions laws passing, which indirectly banned the famous big block Pontiac V8s after a few years. It gutted power of the small blocks as well. Of course, Pontiac was again unfazed and simply began working on other ways to make the cars faster. And in 1980, Pontiac figured out aspiration for their Trans Am Firebirds, pushing power again to numbers similar to that of the Corvette. GM didn't like that, so they took away Pontiac V8s altogether in 1982. Without their iconic V8s anymore, Pontiac found another way to deliver affordable performance: economy compacts. The Fiero was introduced in 1984, and it had a mid-engine inline-4 with rear-wheel drive derived from a front-wheel drive drivetrain, making the Fiero cheap to produce and yet fun to drive. While it did have lower power numbers, except for the rare Super Duty, it achieved far better numbers and efficiency, even getting up to 50 miles per gallon in some situations. The Super Duty, or the SD4, was an SPO aftermarket kit offered by Pontiac Performance, giving the car a mean 2.7-liter inline-4 with 232 horsepower, or a 3.2-liter inline-4 that produced 330 horses, easily beating the 190-horse Firebird Trans Am that also weighed several hundred pounds more, and even putting the Corvette's 205 horsepower to shame. This is a small Pontiac economy car that would be able to outrun a Mustang today. GM, again, did not like that, so they took away all of Pontiac's engines and shut down the Fiero after 1988. If Pontiac couldn't make their own engines or their own unique cars, they would just make the cars they had faster. The Firebird got faster with the Trans Am WS6 package. The Firebird WS6 in 2002 was beginning to approach Corvette speeds, so GM took the F-body away altogether, marking the end of the Firebird and the Camaro. So Pontiac just started importing Holdens and upgrading them, and they resurrected the GTO on the Holden Monaro and gave the Bonneville a successor on the Holden Commodore. Pontiac sales surged once again, even surpassing Buick, the founder of GM. But in 2009, GM went bankrupt. Every brand was at risk, and that would cause many jobs to be lost across the country, so the U.S. agreed to bail out General Motors under the condition that 4 brands were discontinued. Pontiac was one of these brands marked for death due to Pontiac still being considered a filler brand despite its cultural importance at the time. So in 2009, Pontiac was ordered to finish production and close. And so the last official Pontiac off the line was a white G6 sedan in 2010 bound for a rental fleet. This G6 sedan is still in a museum, in a Pontiac museum in Michigan. But even a government order couldn't stop Pontiac. In 2012, GM sold the rights to certain Pontiac names and badges to a third-party company that built the Firebird and GTO again, based on the corresponding Camaros. In 2017, they introduced the Bandit Edition Trans Am. The Bandit had a huge 7.5-liter supercharged V8, which produced over 1,000 horsepower and over 1,000 foot-pounds of torque, and was put through a manual transmission to the back tires. And though only built in small numbers, the few new Firebirds could still put any American muscle car to shame. That ended in 2024 with a discontinuation of the Camaro, and now no Pontiacs are in production, as fans still await the hoped resurrection of the most important automotive brand in American culture. I hope you have enjoyed today's episode, and I have enjoyed speaking to you. Please keep in mind that this podcast can be found on Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube under the same name. I can be found on Instagram and YouTube under the name Tavling Appa. That's Tavling, Tavling, Appa, APA. I've enjoyed talking to you in this episode, and I look forward to talking to you in the next. Merry Christmas.